War is coming, but the battlefield isn't just geographical, it's financial. The dollar's value is declining just as its DNA is transforming. We're entering the exact astrological windows that birthed the greenback, the continental dollar, and the Revolutionary War. If you think your savings are safe, think again. History and astrology show a violent rotation into hard assets. In this deep dive video, I'm going to show you why the 250th anniversary of the United States is the trigger point for a two-tier currency system and the exact timeline for the death and rebirth of the US dollar. So the US is experiencing its first Pluto return, a cycle of about 240 years since 1776, signaling a total structural reset. As Uranus enters Gemini in 2026, I expect the emergence of a two-tier dollar over a 5-year period, a programmable version for the public and an asset-backed version for international settlement. And we'll be looking at a few key dates in this video. February the 20th, 2026, July the 4th, 2026, September 11th, 2026, and April 5th, 2029. It's funny that people still insist that astrology is fake nonsense, especially given its documented use on Wall Street in the 1970s and 1980s. So what can this alternative analysis tool of astrology tell us about the future of the US dollar? The US dollar has been for decades the king of currencies, obviously, essentially dictating the world. Since COVID, though, the narrative of the collapse of the dollar has grown even louder, with roughly a fifth of all dollars in broad circulation being created in 2020 alone, with total money supply still far above pre-COVID levels. The purchasing power of the dollar has also sunk. To have the same purchasing power from a $50,000 salary in the year 1990, you'd have to be making $124,000 US today. And this comes straight from the US Bureau of Labor Statistics' own CPI inflation data. Now think about that. Only around 15% of working people in the USA today make more than $124,000 a year. If you or someone you know was on a $50,000 salary in 1990, well, only 15% of working folks in the USA today have that purchasing power, and that's in the wealthiest country in the world. It's no wonder everything feels more expensive. It is, and by far. No school or government will ever teach its tax slaves about this en masse. It is fundamentally against their interests. This is why Gen Z are disenfranchised, giving up on standardized material goals because of a decimated purchasing power, international globalized competition for jobs, and mass outsourcing and automation of said jobs. With increased competition comes fewer promotion opportunities, alongside rising house, gas, and food prices. It's no wonder that the same generation has been the one to adopt cryptocurrency en masse. They're looking for a solution to what is clearly a broken financial system. With the BRICS nations quietly making progress on a de-dollarization agenda, and the mass incoming transition to the blockchain-based digital financial system, the question is not will the dollar die, but when. There are essentially two different charts that are used today for the US dollar. One is the historical natal birth chart derived from the Coinage Act of April 2nd, 1792 in Philadelphia, Pennsylvania at noon. Astrologers tend to use noon because there is no historically recorded signing time for the Coinage Act, so it's a standard practice to use noon. This act established the US dollar as the standard unit of money backed by gold and silver. It created the US Mint and adopted the decimal system. And this is what I'll be using to forecast general trends. We'll visit the key astrological signatures here later, but first we must backtest the chart to see if it's responsive. Let's look at this bull run case study number 1, February to September 2022. So from February to September 2022, the US dollar index climbed from around 96 to about 110, its highest level since the early 2000s. This chart shows the huge growth of the strength of the dollar against a basket of other global currencies during that time period. So let's view our transit chart from the Coinage Act of 1792 to see if it tracks. The positive astrological indication for the start of this rally is the fact that Jupiter, gaining strength in his own sign of Pisces in the US dollar's 9th house, was conjunct the natal Venus. Strong Jupiter-Venus combinations can speak to wealth enhancement. The Sun was separating from a conjunction with the natal Pluto, representing power, and was in trine to the natal Jupiter, a generally positive aspect. By May 2022, both Venus, planet of wealth, and Jupiter, planet of expansion, were in the 10th house of status and reputation for the US dollar chart. The Sun transited through the 11th house of gains in Taurus, the sign naturally associated with material abundance. Let's look at a bearish case study, January 2025 to June 2025. A very strong example of the US dollar tanking in value was during the first half of 2025 when the US dollar index went through its worst 6 months performance since the index began in the 1970s. From January to June 2025, the index fell by roughly 10%. And this was in part due to the Liberation Day tariffs raising fear of higher inflation and disrupted trade, which prompted investors to dump US assets and the dollar. So let's look at the transit chart for the US dollar at this time. To start off in January, we see a debilitated Jupiter at 11 degrees of Gemini in the 12th house of loss, squaring the natal Venus at 11 degrees of Pisces, challenging the sense of expansion and valuation of the dollar. Chiron, the wounded healer, generally seen as a malefic, was conjunct the US dollar's Mercury, indicating a wounding hit to the trading of the dollar. Chiron on Mercury speaks to wounds relating to trading and transaction, which was a key theme of the trade war which sparked this sell-off. Uranus in Taurus, which has been the signature of vast changes in our financial system, was in a stressful square aspect to the US dollar's natal Pluto, indicating swift and fast changes in perception of the dollar's value, worth, and power. By the time the tariffs were announced in April 2025, a debilitated Mars associated with cutting and severing conjoined the natal ascendant of the US dollar chart at 27 degrees of Cancer. And this really encapsulates the aggressive cutting to trade relationships, which also had a negative impact on the dollar chart and the value of the dollar as a whole. Also, Neptune had just entered Aries, so it gave us a little taste of a new cultural and economic climate that we can expect in 2026. We will be living in that world on a more permanent basis from February 2026 onwards as Neptune enters Aries full-time. And it's funny that the chart that we use for the birth of the dollar also happened on the 2nd of April, 1792, whilst the Liberation Day tariffs occurred on the 2nd of April, 2025, 233 years later. And this is a few decades within the very large Pluto return cycle of the United States itself and the US dollar as we know it. So we know that our current chart for the US dollar is responsive, but before we can make future predictions on the dollar, we need to look at the astrological history of this world-controlling asset. This is very important. So I'm now going to present a few different charts for significant chapters in the US dollar's history. We need to learn the key signatures of these charts if we're able to make informed predictions for the future of the dollar. So let's see if you can spot the striking patterns that emerge. So the Coinage Act of April 2nd, 1792 was just one in a series of historical changes to the dollar that we must take into consideration when speculating on its future trajectory. America first switched from what was known as the Spanish dollar in the early 1700s to the continental dollar in 1775. The continental dollar was issued in an attempt to fund the American Revolutionary War, which occurred from 1775 to 1783. As we will revisit later on, this chart for the start of the American Revolutionary War contains Uranus, the planet associated with revolution and rebellion, at the first degree of Gemini. In 2026, Uranus will be entering Gemini full-time, entering within the first degree by April 25th, 2026. Chiron, the wounded healer, was placed at 13 degrees of Aries. The continental dollar depreciated very quickly after the end of the Revolutionary War. By 1792, the US dollar was defined in law by the Coinage Act, which is where we get our current chart for the dollar for astrological purposes. As we'll touch upon later, Saturn was placed in late Aries, whilst Pluto was in late Aquarius. Jupiter was in Libra, and these signatures repeat quite soon. Decades later, by 1861, America had to solve a new Civil War funding crisis. After declaring independence from Britain, the internal conflict grew between the Union and the seceding southern states, the Confederacy. and the greenback became the new form of fiat paper money that was issued. Again, to fund the American Civil War. This came in with the first legal tender act of February 25th, 1862 during the Civil War. As we see in the chart for the issuance of the greenback to fund the Civil War, Neptune was at the first degree of Aries, and Uranus was in mid-Gemini. Again, we have a very similar setup in Q1 and Q2 of 2026, with Neptune entering the first degree of Aries and Uranus entering Gemini. Fast forward a few more decades, and the 1900s sees the Gold Standard Act, which commits the US dollar solely to gold, ending the former bimetallic standard of tying it both to gold and silver. And 44 years later, during World War II, the Bretton Woods Agreement was signed on July 22, 1944, with the IMF and World Bank becoming operational in 1945. This was crucial for the dollar because it cemented it as the central anchor of the post-war global economy. This agreement is why the US dollar has been the global standard for 81 years now. Uranus was in Gemini for the major period of World War II. Uranus has a cycle of 84 years, so it will enter Gemini in April 2026 for the first time since the 1940 to 1949 period. In our chart for the issuance of the greenback, Uranus is placed at 12 Gemini. In the Bretton Woods chart, it's at 11 Gemini. But that wasn't the last major change we've seen to the dollar this century. The Nixon shock of August 15th, 1971 ended the convertibility of the dollar into gold for foreign governments, and this turned the dollar into a pure fiat reserve currency as we know it today, and its value has been decreasing ever since. This event marks the de-pegging of the dollar from hard assets into an essentially infinitely printable fiat currency. 55 years later, is the fiat experiment coming to an end? So as you saw, there is a major pattern which underlies all of these charts, which have been transformational for the US dollar. Uranus in Gemini, Neptune in Aries, and Pluto in Aquarius. Incredibly, for the first time in probably tens of thousands of years, these aspects are all going to be active in 2026 and the years onwards. The US dollar has historically undergone massive structural reinvention whenever Uranus is in Gemini. Now, this is a 7-year-long transit through the sign of Gemini, occurring every 82 years. Uranus will re-enter Gemini on a permanent basis for its next 7-year cycle in April 2026. We also find that Neptune in Aries historically correlates with major wars involving America. Neptune will re-enter Aries for the next 13 years, starting with a potent conjunction with Saturn at 0 degrees of Aries on February 20th, 2026. So note the correlations. The Revolutionary War chart of 1775, Uranus was at 0 Gemini. The greenback issuance chart of 1862, Uranus was at 12 Gemini, Neptune was at 0 Aries. The Bretton Woods Act of 1944, Uranus at 11 Gemini. The Gold Standard Act of 1900, Pluto was at 14 Gemini, opposing Uranus. It takes 84 years for Uranus to transit the zodiac and 165 years for Neptune. You can see that these are major long-term cycles which have appeared quite clearly in the key moments in the history of America's currency. So we naturally expect the US dollar to take its next shape and form within the next 7 years. Because we simultaneously have Neptune in Aries alongside Uranus in Gemini and Pluto in Aquarius, I believe this change will, just like the issuance of the greenback, be used to fund a new major war conflict. We also see the theme of the anaretic degree. The anaretic degree is the 29th degree of any sign. Anaretic degrees point to periods of time associated with crisis and urgency. Think of the word anorexic. We see this theme emerge too in the history of the dollar. Again, in the Revolutionary War chart, the sun was at 29 Aries. In the Bretton Woods chart, the sun was at 29 Cancer. In the greenback issuance, the moon was at 29 Capricorn. The dollar evolves never through sensible gradual policy, but pretty much always through major urgent events and crises. For our Coinage Act chart of 1792, Pluto was in Aquarius, so the definition of the US dollar as we know it is undergoing a Pluto return, and we are back in the same quality of time after 248 years. The themes of the Pluto return include major upheaval, transformation, loss and rediscovery of power, but always fundamental change. The sign of Aquarius is about the technologies that link all of us in this emerging digitally powered financial world. Using this analysis of these historically correlative qualities of time, What does this mean for the future of the dollar? I'm going to split the future projection for the dollar into two parts. This first part will focus only on the details of 2026. The second part will use the various historical charts that we've analyzed at the start of this video to project when the US dollar goes through its fundamental transformation and what that looks like. From April 2nd, 2025 through to April 2nd, 2026, the US dollar is in a sixth house perfection year. It's funny that this inauspicious year, associated with grinding problems, obstacles, health issues, and burdens, started exactly on the Liberation Day of April 2nd, 2025. This also saw the worst performing time period for the US dollar in decades, as per our DXY chart analysis previously. From April 2026, it enters the seventh house year, defined by relationships, open enemies, transactions, partnerships, deals, and other people or nations. The theme of friendly or adversarial relationships will be behind the dollar's value in 2026. Before we dive into the specific key dates of 2026, let's take a broad view at the Varshafala, the Vedic solar return chart that attempts to describe the results of the year for the dollar from April 2026 through to April 2027. So the chart is a Pisces ascendant with Jupiter positively placed in the fifth house of speculation and investment. Mercury, planet of trade, is placed within 2 degrees of the ascendant. Mars, associated with cutting, is also conjoining the ascendant. Saturn and Neptune are conjunct in the second house of liquid money, once again showing us this great reset signature. The Sun also highlights the focus on everyday money and resources for this chart. The second house ruler is in the first, and the Moon is in the eighth house of crisis, debt, and investment money, ruled by Venus in her own sign of Taurus in the third house. It's actually a fairly mixed bag with some positive and some negative elements. So here's what it kind of translates to. It's a crisis in valuation. Sun, Saturn, Chiron, Neptune in the second house. Sixth house lord of debt is in the second house. So this is caused by the insurmountable US national debt, followed by money printing, which is Jupiter exalted in the fifth house, which temporarily restores some balance and value. The macro theme for me here is a crisis of valuation, followed by printing into a bubble. Let's view the specific dates of 2026, which could trigger these results. February 17th, 2026. The solar eclipse at 28 degrees of Aquarius. This is quite bearish. Whatever the events follow in the February 17th solar eclipse in Aquarius, if we use the Saratobhadra chakra to look at the Veda or aspect of different planets on the Jamba or moon nakshatra of our dollar chart, you can see that there is aspect from Mars, Sun, and the Moon on Ashlesha nakshatra, the moon nakshatra in the US dollar chart. This is again confirming that some level of military action could be impacting the value of the dollar around this time. Give it 2 or 3 weeks after this eclipse occurs. February 20th, 2026, the Saturn-Neptune conjunction. This is quite bearish. The great Saturn-Neptune conjunction is marked as a great reset transit. The ideals of Neptune merging, concretizing with the material reality of Saturn at 0 degrees of Aries, known as the world point. This signals a new era for the global order. The last time we saw a Saturn-Neptune conjunction in any sign was during the fall of the Berlin Wall. Neptune is idealism, communism, Saturn is collapse, restriction, and negativity. And the synodic cycle of Saturn and Neptune shows heavy correlation with Russian history too, so I fully expect the Russia-Ukraine situation to be a key story around this time. We got a taste of Neptune in Aries in 2025 with the Liberation Day tariffs, which were announced pretty much exactly as Neptune entered Aries for the first time in 165 years, as we saw in the chart for the start of the American Revolutionary War with Neptune at 0 Aries. This era likely kicks off with a military crisis. This Great Reset transit is also significantly impacting the reputation and status sector of the dollar's chart. So I believe this brings major conflict and increase in war activities from the US, both antagonizing their allies and their enemies. And this is also the time frame for one of my key 2026 predictions, the February Federal Reserve crisis. So expect panic and a crisis of confidence in the Federal Reserve around February 20th onwards, which could impact the dollar. This could be a change in leadership or a fundamental clash between the Fed's sensible and analytical policies against the militaristic glory chasing of the commander-in-chief. To confirm the war theme, throughout 2026 and 2027, Saturn will be in Aries, causing likely war flare-ups and wreaking havoc on the 10th house of the dollar's reputation and status. So overall, it's not bullish at all. April 17th, 2026, K2 sub-period for the USA begins. This is quite bearish. So if we choose to use the liberation chart for the USA set to July 2nd, 1776, when the congressional vote for independence actually occurred in Philadelphia, Pennsylvania, we see that this chart for the USA is going to start a K2 sub-period from March 17th, 2026. And this represents loss, dissolution, reduction in energy, anti-materialism, a sense of loss pervading the US. This presents fundamentally bearish backdrops for this time period for the US and therefore the dollar, from 17th of March 2026 through to October 20th, 2026. April 15th, 2026, the Aries build-up. This is volatile and quite bearish. By April 15th, we see a huge stellium in Aries, and for me, this is when we see significant war flare-ups and war activity in 2026. And naturally, this places a lot of attention on the public reputation and status of the dollar. With Chiron, the Sun, Saturn, Mars, Neptune, the Moon, and Mercury all in Aries, I do expect an increase in war activities at this time. And this naturally draws a lot of attention to the US and US dollar at this time, as this build-up occurs in the 10th house of reputation and status for the US dollar chart. Now in April, Uranus will also enter the first degree of Gemini, an exact Uranus return for the chart of the Revolutionary War. In my view, there is heavily bearish volatility around this time. If the US ramps up its involvement in regional wars and trade wars, traders and investors will likely flock away from the dollar and even further into traditional safe havens like gold, silver, copper, and other commodities. Bitcoin will decline because it reacts to the macroeconomic situation. And this will continue the commodities surge, just like I predicted in my Financial Astrology of 2026 report, which you can get for free for subscribing to my Substack. The 4th of July 2026, an explosive event in the USA. This is bearish. When we look at the USA Sibley chart, which is a commonly used chart for the USA, which differs from the Liberation chart, for the 4th of July 2026, we see an explosive combination, and it's not just the fireworks. Mars and Uranus are co-present in the 7th house of relationships and enemies in the USA's natal chart. So this is an explosive inbuilt signature, which not only shows the level of military advancement in the US, but also how the country celebrates its independence, because Mars and Uranus, fast-moving explosive things, that's fireworks. But this 4th of July is a vitally important one for the US. Not only is it the 250th anniversary of the United States, but we also see Mars and Uranus conjoin at 3 degrees of Gemini. And in my view, this represents an explosive, obviously politically charged event, which could be a catalyst for the USA to become more involved in a global conflict. And this would obviously be bearish for the dollar, especially if more money printing or quantitative easing is required as a result of this explosive event. So we saw this happen on the issuance of the greenback. This conjunction occurs right on the fixed star Murphak, associated with bold, heroic, but rash and morally ambiguous influences. It speaks to courage, large-scale impact, and overconfidence. For the dollar chart, this occurs in the 12th house of loss, dispersion of energy, and weakness. So when Jupiter hits 22 degrees of Leo, it will conjoin the Sun in the chart for the Nixon shock. And this could indicate inflationary pressure or a massive expansion of monetary supply. Leo and the Sun is naturally associated with gold, and I believe this leads to an extensive money printing period by September 2026. The 11th of September, money printing, bearish. The US dollar chart has its natal Saturn in late Aries, and this means that the US dollar is going through a Saturn return. This occurs once every 28 to 30 years and signifies a challenging time period where restrictions, negativity, responsibility, and obstacles are thrown at the thing in question. The dollar has to deal with extensive pressure to evolve into the next phase in its maturation and structural reality. This is a period where pressures surmount on the dollar so that it may be formed by that pressure into the next iteration of what the dollar may be. But this brings significant challenges and changes. We will certainly be seeing the effects of this debilitated Saturn and the start of the Saturn return process when it conjoins the US dollar chart's midheaven and Sun at 13 degrees of Aries in September 2026. While Saturn is conjoining the dollar's midheaven and sun, this signals real negative issues and obstacles in the dollar's reputation. Transiting Jupiter, planet of expansion, is at 14-15 degrees of Leo at this time and conjoins the natal Uranus. Now, Jupiter-Uranus combinations bring intense growth, expansion, breakthroughs, and are generally very positive. So what could this be? In my opinion, this is a signal for big money printing and further quantitative easing. Just as we hinted in our Vedic solar return chart, the overexpansion energy of Jupiter-Uranus in the second house of liquid money, whilst the debilitated Saturn is conjoining the midheaven, screams dollar crisis, launch the money printer, at least to me. It could also coincide with the virus or health issue that I anticipate to emerge from August 2026. 24th of September 2026. Money printing impact visible. Bearish. Once the money printer starts, we give it a few weeks until the 24th of September when a debilitated Mars conjoins the ascendant for the dollar chart. This is the same signature we saw after the Liberation Day tariffs and in the middle of the dollar index's largest decline for decades. Mars is cutting and attacking. It's debilitated in Cancer and is hacking away at the value and identity of the dollar at this time. Saturn conjoins the midheaven, bringing the doom and gloom to the reputation of the dollar. The 25th of October 2026, transit Mars conjoins the USD's Uranus. Bearish. On the 25th of October, transiting Mars will conjoin the dollar's natal Uranus at 15 degrees of Leo. It is also essentially conjunct the moon within 2 degrees. And this signature brings unexpected shocks and volatile cuts and attacks to the dollar. This could be the aftermath of the money printing, but it looks like an attack of the value of the dollar from an unexpected source. And this seems to set the tone for the rest of Q4 2026 for the dollar and into the end of 2026. The biggest development in the face of a weakening dollar in Q1, Q2, and Q3 2026 is my anticipation that in the face of a war funding crisis, the money printer will return by September 2026. And this will be temporarily good for the dollar, but the real winners will be gold, silver, and to some extent Bitcoin in the long run. So over the next 5 years, Neptune entering Aries and Uranus entering Gemini are the biggest indicators of the future of the US dollar and the US itself. And as we saw at the start of the video, new currencies usually arrive to fund crisis periods like wars. Historically, war finance is an absolutely key driver of new currencies being introduced. The Saturn-Neptune conjunction in the 10th house of the US dollar chart brings a clash between restriction, which is Saturn, and idealism, which is Neptune. If a new war were to break out and we needed to move away from the currently weak fiat paper dollar, what is the most likely outcome? It's a digital dollar, or a CBDC, based on modern blockchain and distributed ledger technology. Why does war require a digital dollar? Because modern war requires instant, real-time stimulus, instant transactions, lightning-fast total supply chain tracking, so you cannot fight a 2026 war with 1970s banking rails. The CBDC isn't just about control, it's also a military necessity. All wars are bankers' wars. The CBDC will be a military necessity. Modern warfare is won or lost on the speed of liquidity. So the problem is that the current financial system is a national security risk. We cannot move and track capital at the lightning speed of modern combat. The reaction? The public outcry over privacy is dismissed as a luxury that the nation can no longer afford. Adoption is framed as the patriotic thing to do, the financial equivalent of a draft. And the solution is to onboard the public to a programmable fiat digital dollar to support the conflict and gain economic insights previously thought impossible. The elite asset holders begin transitioning to asset-backed international payment rails, which are developed behind the curtain to ensure American long-term financial dominance and competitiveness. Now, August the 12th, 2026 sees a solar eclipse representing major beginnings and endings at 20 degrees of Leo. But more interestingly, it's also an eclipse that belongs to Saros Series 126, a key financial series. So let's simply look at the financial themes of previous Saros Series 126 eclipses. We could easily see August 2026 marking the rushed onset of the digital dollar. Post-August 2026 likely represents the time window where the dollar begins going on-chain. By the 5th of March 2027, Saturn will recross 13 degrees of Aries, as it did in 2026 due to its retrograde, right over the sun in the Coinage Act chart for the dollar as we know it. And this is like a paintbrush sweeping another thick layer of difficulties for the fiat dollar, which by now likely finds itself in a war scenario and a funding crisis. Notice the Jupiter-Ketu conjunction in Leo within 5 degrees of the natal Uranus and Moon. In my research, Ketu represents blockchain technology, so this is a real key period for when we could see the mass rollout of the blockchain-based digital dollar. By 2030, the new digital currency becomes the only option for the common person. Physical cash is fully phased out. Remember, 11 and 12 degrees of Gemini seem to be critical degrees, as was shown in the chart for the issuance of the greenback and the Bretton Woods Agreement. Uranus returns to 11 degrees of Gemini by 5th of April 2029, when our chart for the US dollar will have its Jupiter return. Therefore, the new CBDC, or digital dollar, should be active and widely implemented by April 2029. But a major question still remains. Will this new digital dollar, this CBDC, be backed by gold or silver? Is it backed by Bitcoin? So let's take a look at the transit chart for the chart of the 1900 Gold Standard Act. By September 2028, transiting Uranus, which represents innovative technology, conjoins the natal Pluto, representing power and wealth of the chart for the Gold Standard Act. This is a very potent cycle that only happens once per 84 years. This seems to indicate a digital dollar, Uranus, being backed by gold, the Pluto of the Gold Standard Act. This will also represent the Uranus return of the Bretton Woods chart, indicating a modern technological enhancement to the spirit of backing the dollar with hard assets. So far, the US government is telling us that the likely outcome is the transition to a programmable fiat digital dollar, a CBDC controlled by the Federal Reserve. But remember, the Great Reset transit of Saturn and Neptune will conjunct the midheaven of the Federal Reserve, creating a crisis in late February, which could fundamentally disrupt the roadmap that may have already been in place for a few years. The intended outcome for the US government is obviously to maintain the primacy of the dollar by keeping it fiat, but with digital rails to improve speed and efficiency. However, I believe we will enter a multipolar world order, where the decline of the fiat dollar, even if it turns digital, is matched by the rise of the BRICS nations' currencies and similar digital currency projects, which aim to be backed by gold. These will both, in turn, be competing with Bitcoin or next-generation private money like Zcash. The BRICS unit prototype has already launched, and it is already partially anchored by gold, partially by a basket of BRICS nations' currencies. It's currently a settlement mechanism, not a currency that you can buy on an exchange. So how does this impact the value of the dollar? Because BRICS nations can settle oil trades in their native currencies or the new bridge unit rather than dollars. And this softens global demand for the US dollar quite significantly, amongst other effects. The US will fight back by attempting to make dollar transactions and dollar settlements faster with blockchain technology. The lightning-fast new blockchain technology is the leveling of the playing field, which is very Pluto in Aquarius. So what does this mean for the future of the dollar? Here's my thesis. In late 2026, under the pressures of a war funding crisis, the US accelerates a wholesale CBDC for government and bank use to track war spending and quantitative easing instantly. By 2027, the common person uses a programmable fiat digital dollar as cash is phased out. This keeps the day-to-day societal transition smooth and doesn't prevent instant quantitative easing from happening if the US needs it during this new conflict. However, the international settlement dollar may move towards being gold-anchored to gain trust and to compete with the gold-backed BRICS unit. By 2030, the paper dollar is retired, cash is gone. The dollar only survives as a digital asset which competes in a multipolar monetary world order consisting of the digital fiat dollar, gold-backed global USD payment rails, the BRICS unit, and Bitcoin. So remember, this is a period of Uranus, shock, disruption, and technology in Gemini, the sign of dualities, two-tier or dual-circuit systems. Pluto in Aquarius levels the playing field of power with revolutionary technology. The US government will build a technological wall so that the everyday person uses a zero-privacy digital fiat dollar for spending, whilst international payment rails are backed by gold. The little person will not be granted access to this gold-backed international payment dollar. This creates further class division. The elite get access to the hard asset-backed futuristic large payment rail system, while the public gets stuck with inflation-prone, zero-privacy digital money. and this system is fully online by 2029, brought in under a war crisis, with cash being phased out by 2030. This is very archetypally resonant with a Pluto in Aquarius and Uranus in Gemini period of time. Uranus in Gemini can translate to the technological Uranus, splitting Gemini, of trade and transaction, also Gemini. It speaks to a power shift regarding how networks of information and payments are managed, and about the inevitable power clash between the leaders and the public, getting more neutralized by the year with better and better financial technology, which starts to level the global financial playing field. For a trader or an investor, the danger isn't just a slow decline in the value of the dollar. It's the breakdown of predictable behavior of the fiat dollar over the next 5 years, and therefore most stocks in the US market. The transition to the digital fiat dollar will not be smooth and will roll out in phases, during which the DXY will see whipsaw volatility. The real question for traders and investors is, do you want to participate in that whipsaw volatility or move to hard assets such as gold and silver in an increasingly unstable world with an increasingly unstable fiat dollar, whilst international payment rails may require commodities for the trust and verification process? Every time Uranus enters Gemini, the United States changes the form of its money to fund a new era of survival. In 1775, it printed continental dollars to fight for independence. In 1862, it printed greenbacks to save the Union. In 1944, the Bretton Woods Agreement stabilized the dollar and the world. In 2026 to 2028, the transition to the digital fiat dollar will begin. And every time that Neptune enters Aries, the United States finds itself in a major conflict. In 1536, the Conquistador Wars occurred on North American land. Neptune entered early Aries. In 1702, the War of the Spanish Succession began. Again, Neptune entered early Aries. In 1861, the American Civil War began. Neptune was in early Aries. From January 26, Neptune returns to early Aries and stays for 13 years. Therefore, between 2026 and 2030, we will likely see the most significant overhaul of the US financial system since 1944. This occurs through the need to fund a new war mission, but leads to a multipolar currency order in which the fiat digital dollar competes with the commodity-backed BRICS nations unit, whilst both compete with gold standard decentralization cryptocurrencies such as Bitcoin. Traders and investors most likely to stand to benefit from the coming upheaval by transitioning into gold, silver, and other commodities in 2026, and into Bitcoin by late 2026. Thank you for watching this video on the future of the US dollar for 2026 through to 2030. If you'd like to further support my work and gain insight into your own personal financial astrology, I offer a range of personal financial astrology services on my store. If you're interested in more deep dive reports, analysis, astrological correlations between economic events, please sign up to my Substack where I'm active pretty much every day. It's just Rowan's Financial Astrology on Substack. Thank you so much for watching.